So this is actually one of the first programs for the conference. So for some of you, may only be here for the day. Some of you will be here for the week, and some of you will be here for a couple days. So the way that I've approached this historically is, even though copy of the presentation, the PowerPoints, and any of the reference materials that I show on the screen are downloaded, and you can download them, it's not my program. The way I look at it and view it, it's your program. So what adds value to the program is if you have particular questions, or if I presume something or assume something, or I don't qualify or define something that you're not familiar with, feel free to stop me in my tracks. So we have 4 hours, and we have 41 slides. So I'm going to embellish on what the slides mean, how it applies to us in the real world. And we have probably an eclectic audience. I suspect some of you have a lot of familiarity or some familiarity with hazardous waste. There may be others of you in this room that have not as much familiarity or no familiarity with what makes a waste a hazardous waste. And this is not complicated, and it's very complicated. It's easily understandable, and it has lots of paths. So there is exceptions to the rules to just about everything I'm going to tell you. On top of that, because we're in the state of California, what governs what makes a waste a hazardous waste is driven by both statute and regulation. Statute says, hey, if it's going to hurt something, we're going to regulate it, and regulation says this is how we define it. But we also have a parallel program that occurs at the federal level, and we've adopted that when we became an authorized state in '92. So there are there's federal criteria that we'll discuss. There's a state criteria that we'll discuss. We're going to merge them together, but we have a tendency at times for people that don't have a lot of familiarity trying to keep track of the bigger picture. And so I've got a slide about a third of the way through the program that we're going to describe how we're going to kind of dissect this and talk about it. But it doesn't benefit you if I lose you. So, and if I lose you, I probably lost a certain percentage of the audience. So my point to all this is your program, it's not mine. So because it's your program, feel free to ask questions. Okay, what I'd like to do is, how many people have no familiarity in the state of California on what makes a waste a hazardous waste? Okay, there's about 10. Okay, how many people here represent city or county at the CUPA or enforcement level? About half. How many people from industry? About half. All right. So we'll take a break at about, I think it's 9:45. We'll come back 10 o'clock, and then we'll finish up about 11:30, 11:45. So feel free to approach me on the break. Feel free to approach me after the program. If there's anything that I can do to help you out, I have a vested interest in trying to help people sort through this. And I've sorted through it for a long time. I'm still sorting through it. So whatever I can do to help you, I'll do it. All right, having said that, what you can download, it's actually on the CUPA forum. You can download the PowerPoint program as well as the attachments. But the program itself deals with what makes a waste a hazardous waste. So we have a law, I call it a statute, and then we have a regulation. We find it in Title 22, Title 23, in the state of California, and then we got the same thing that occurs federally in 40 CFR. And so if you look at the laws and the statutes and the regulations and the tech memos and the management memos and the clarifications and the case histories, we come up with a whole lot of terms that we are acronym driven. You have a term called NRC. What does NRC mean? What does it mean? National Response Center. I like that. Is that it? How about non-reusable container? Huh? Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I'm old, but I used to know all 6. That's 3. My point is, is that if I use an acronym that is something that I might be a little more conversant with, and you're not familiar with it, I've just made an injustice. I've just served you an injustice. So we are driven by acronyms. So if something doesn't fit the schematic that has been painted for you, by all means, feel free to ask questions. So, and there's a lot of acronyms in this field. All right, having said that, if you look at the way we've structured things in the state of California, so the legislature, California legislature, will look at a body, a law, and they'll look at it, and discuss it, and people lobby for it, and then it gets passed. And it gets signed by the governor. That becomes law. You and I would call that a statute. That's found in the California Health and Safety Code. Then they give that statute to a regulatory body, predominantly USC, Cali PA, Department of Toxics. And they'll take that statute and they'll write a proposed regulation. This is how we feel we need to implement this statute. And at the bottom of the regulation, it'll reference where within the statute or statutes that they get the authority to do what they're proposing to do or how they're going to regulate it. And so if you look in Title 22 and Title 23, at the end of the different sections, it'll actually reference and tie back to where within the statute that this regulation was born from, or where it was fostered from, or what's driving it. That's a regulation. A regulation is something that provides guidance for the enforcement community on how we're to comply with the regulations or how we're going to comply with the law. So that's a regulation. And then this is the world you and I live in. It's black and white and a lot of gray. Okay? It's a little bit of black, a little bit of white, a lot of gray. So you'll find that in certain instances there is certain things that are subject to interpretation. And it's that subject to interpretation that is generally sorted out in a legal quorum in a court of law, and we call that case history. So if that grade is defined by case history under that certain specific set of circumstances, then we kind of have a legal body of how that's to be enforced or interpreted or applied to industry or enforced by agencies. And that occurs in the state of California. But I'm not an attorney, and most of us in here are not attorneys. So what I think or what I feel or what I know has no more bearing than what you feel or what you think or how you apply it. So when we look at certain areas that are gray, and it's not so much for what makes a waste a hazardous waste, but when we talk about wastes that are reactive, it's a little subjective. It's not definitive. But when we talk about wastes that are corrosive or ignitable, those are pretty definitive. Those are pretty much black and white. But there's gray that exists with what we're going to discuss. Okay, so what we find for hazardous waste, California, we find that in the state of California, Title 22, predominantly Section 66-260 through 66-268, defines what makes a waste a hazardous waste. And some of what we may touch on today, also you'll find regulatory guidance in the statutes called the law that are not excerpted, they're not written into the regulations. There's something called an excluded recyclable material. It's an exception to the rule. And some of the rules we find in the statute, most of the rules we find in the regulations. So there's exceptions to the rules, but about 95% of what we're going to discuss today is actually found in the regulations, and that regulation is found in Title 22 in the state of California. All right, so we have state terms, federal terms, and then other terms. So here's some of the state terms. These are state-driven terms, state-defined terms. They apply mostly to non-recre-hazardous wastes, although they can apply to recre-hazardous waste. And the first one listed is industrial wastes. The regulatory structure update back in the 1990s looked at trying to simplify the regulatory criteria for how we govern waste in the state of California. And so they came out and they defined what an industrial waste was. And it's pretty simple. It's a waste that comes from an industry. Some industrial wastes are hazardous waste. They meet the definition of a hazardous waste, state or federal. We'll talk about that. Some industrial wastes do not meet the definition of a hazardous waste by state or federal definition. And some of them are excluded from the federal definition. Some are excluded from the state definition. A classic example would be household hazardous waste. Household hazardous waste excluded from the federal definition of a hazardous waste. Not from California's definition. We consider it a hazardous waste. But it's excluded federally, so it's not a record hazardous waste. So there's a lot of these exceptions to the rules. But if I have an industrial waste that is not a federal hazardous waste, I have an industrial waste that's not a California non-record hazardous waste, then the presumption that we paint the industry is that it's not a hazardous waste. Well, it's not a federal and it's not a state, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's not subject to a different set of circumstances or a different set of regulations. The Water Board, Fish and Game, and the state agency at their discretion can designate something a designated waste because it poses some type of threat to the environment. And when we take it to a landfill or leave it at a specific area in the state of California, it could potentially cause environmental degradation. It can cause a negative impact to the environment. So we do find, in certain instances, that the permit conditions at a landfill, Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, that exist in the state of California, that permit may not allow that facility to accept a certain type of waste. And if I was to take my waste that's not hazardous, it's not state hazardous waste, it's not federal hazardous waste, it's what you and I would consider to be non-hazardous waste, it actually could pose a threat to the environment, and that's referred to as a designated waste. That requires a concurrence from a state agency as to maybe how I would manage it. That would require a dialogue to exist between the state as well as the responsible party. So this was kind of all outlined when we talk about industrial waste, because we have about 8 to 10 classes of hazardous wastes, and we have about another 4 or 5 classes of wastes that are not hazardous, but they're designated. They're inert wastes. They're non-hazardous wastes. We've tiered it. There's a lot of tiers. It's not black or white. There's a lot of gray that exists between what is hazardous and what is not. Okay, California came out with a list of chemicals. It's about 300. They have an asterisk that appears in Appendix 10 to Chapter 11 in Title 22. So there's a list of chemicals. There's 791 chemicals that are in Title 22. And it says that if you have a waste that comes from a process or not even a process that includes this chemical, we consider it, in the state of California, a presumptive hazardous waste. I'm going to say the same thing differently. California, in their infinite wisdom, has decided that if your waste has any one of these 791 chemicals, that makes it a hazardous waste. Presumably. They call that the presumptive list. I got a question for you. How many chemicals are used in the state of California? Does anybody know? 80,000. That's a good guess. I don't have a clue. It's been presumed somewhere between 600,000 and 1.4 million. I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I know this. It's more than 791 chemicals. So they came up with this list, and it was back in the 80s. And it said that if you have this chemical included in your waste, then we presume it to be hazardous. It might not be, and it might be. So, and if it is, then you have to manage it as a hazardous waste. But if it's not a hazardous waste, according to this other criteria that we talk about, then it's not. You want me to say the same thing differently? This list of presumptive hazardous wastes means nothing. Got it? Okay, except there is a greater likelihood that a regulatory agency is more likely to scrutinize your decisions that it's not if you have a waste stream that includes that chemical, because that was targeted on this list. They call it the presumptive list. And the presumptive list presumes that it's hazardous. Doesn't have to be. In some instances it's not. It's just that's a presumptive list. That's the presumption. So there's a greater burden that I share being a responsible party, call it generator, to determine, hey, is it truly is or isn't. I got to look a little more closely at this list. Okay, on that list, it's 791 chemicals listed. It's actually 785. 6 numbers were aborted. The chemical disappeared. But on that list of chemicals, there is an asterisk that appears in the appendices to Chapter 10 and Title 22. And what that asterisk means is this waste, this chemical, poses a greater risk to the environment. And so we are going to charge industry more if they dispose of it or treat it or produce it or generate it. We're going to call that an extremely hazardous waste. And that by definition is something that's more toxic than being toxic. We've got the same thing kind of going on federally. We have something called acutely hazardous wastes under RCRA that we haven't talked about. But federally, there's a list, and then there's this extra toxic list. Same thing occurs at the federal level as the state level. We call our list extremely hazardous waste, and they have asterisks. That's about 300 chemicals. Okay, the term non-RCRA hazardous waste. Non-RCRA indicates that it's not subject to hazardous waste regulations federally under RCRA. However, we, California, have put together a criteria that we'll talk about today that has captured it as a hazardous waste. And that criteria that captures it means it's a hazardous waste. Not according to the federal guidelines, but it's according to the state of California criteria. So we refer to that as a non-RCRA, non-federally regulated under RCRA hazardous waste. Footnote, we have certain non-RCRA hazardous wastes that are subject to federal regulation. Okay, I just threw you a curveball. Non-RCRA hazardous wastes aren't subject to federal RCRA regulations. Got that? But they may be subject to FIFRA or TSCA or CERCLA, or there may be something else that governs them in terms of what I can and can't do, land disposal restrictions, that makes it subject to a federal regulation, but it's not subject to RCRA regulations, nor is it defined by RCRA. A classic example would be asbestos, it's friable, and polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. Those are regulated by TSCA. Those are hazardous waste federally under certain circumstances, but they're not subject to RCRA, they're not defined by RCRA, they're not governed by RCRA. So we call them a non-RCRA hazardous waste, but they are still subject to certain federal regulations in terms of disposal and criteria and the like. Okay, then we have, in California, we have something called the waste extraction test. And we're going to talk about that here probably after the break. The waste extraction test is called the WET test. Now, it should be acronyms that are abbreviated up here, W-E-T. And what waste extraction test does is it says, got an idea. Federally, we're going to simulate the conditions that occur in a landfill. So if I bury a drum and it dissolves and I start to have chemicals that migrate in the soil, what's the chance of it causing environmental damage? Now, that process federally is called TCLIP. California took the same concept that came out in '76 and they said, great idea. So they developed a methodology a couple years later that said, let's have that same type of methodology determine the fate of a chemical if I bury it in the ground. So we're going to call it the waste extraction test. And let's have 2 tests, not 1. So the waste extraction test is a combination of 2 tests. It's both the soluble threshold leachate concentration and it's the total threshold leachate concentration. So we call that STLC and TTLC, and in layman's terms it's like this. How much arsenic, cadmium, chromium, molybdenum, selenium is in this water? I'm going to test it. and I'm going to figure out how much is in the water in milligrams per kilogram. It could be in soil or dirt. It could be in anything, a matrix, epoxy, and a resin. How much is in my hazardous waste? They're going to pull it all out. They're going to quantify it, and that's the total. That makes sense. How much is in there? That makes sense. That's the total. And then the other part of the wet test says, I got another idea. If I've got dirt or soil, let's go ahead and let's simulate the conditions that occur in a landfill in the state of California. So let's take the wastes that we produce, whether it's a solid, liquid, gaseous, or sludge, and we'll simulate what happens if it's buried in a landfill. So we're going to put it in the dirt, and then we're going to extract a certain portion of it from the dirt, and we're going to see how mobile it is in the dirt. So we'll come up with an extraction test that kind of simulates the conditions that occur to a landfill. And we're going to only determine the soluble phase that's likely to move. I'll call that the mobile phase. How much is likely to dissolve? I don't care how much is in there total, but what's the likelihood that it's going to migrate in the dirt? And that test is called the STLC. That's the soluble threshold. And under the wet test, in California, which we call the waste extraction test, if I've got a waste that exceeds either of those two benchmarks, California says, congratulations. That is a California non-RCRA hazardous waste. And I'll talk more about the methodology probably after the break, but that's what we refer to as a hazardous waste in the state of California. Clear as mud? We good? It took me, and I'm not a smart guy. I'm really not that smart. It took me a while to figure that out. So all 113 of you got it? All right. I will bet $1 bazillion I talked to somebody on the break about this. $1 bazillion. All right. Okay, an excluded recyclable material. All right, so California says, yeah, you know, this is what makes a waste a hazardous waste. Here's the criteria. We'll talk about that. Oh, you reuse it. You reuse it on site. So you use it, and then you collect it after use, and you do something to it, and then you reuse it on site. You can do that. You can do that. That's called used or spent. The difference between used and spent is that California says that if you use it and you then take it out of the process and then you reuse it, that's called recycling. You can do it. You can do it. I can do it. But if it's been used and you take it out of a process, you can put it back in the process. You can do that. We can do that. Industry can do that. If you use it and you take it out of the process and then you decide to reuse it, you can do that as well. I can do that. But I can't do that until I do something to it. So I'm going to call that treatment. So I filter it, reverse osmosis, I do phase separation. Some of that's considered treatment, and you can do that. May require a permit, may not. But then I'm going to put it back into a process. So, and you can do it. I can do it. Industry can do that. But while I temporarily have taken it out of a process and I store it on an interim basis before I treat it or reuse it, California says that's your intention is to reuse it, so that's called recycling. And recycling is a waste management practice. So it becomes subject to being a hazardous waste in California. There's exceptions that exist federally, but we're in California, so those exceptions really don't apply. So California says, yeah, we're going to give you kind of an option here that allows some flexibility in how that's accomplished. And that is not found in the regulation. That is found in the Health and Safety Code. And the guidelines on how that's accomplished is found in the Health and Safety Code. So it's not in the regulations. And that exception to the rule is found in the Health and Safety Code, section 25143.2. Health and Safety Code, section 25143.2. And it says that if I use something, so it's got to be a waste. So to be an excluded recyclable material, I've used it, I collect it, meets the definition of a hazardous waste, but I'm going to use it again. And so an excluded recyclable material, by definition, is a hazardous waste. And I can reuse it. And how I do that, how I mark it, how I label it, how I report it, how it's recorded, whether I have to file a recyclable materials report with my CUPA, DTSC, that all is governed by where is it slotted, because there's 4 paragraphs, A, B, C, and D. So it could be a RCRA waste, it may be a non-RCRA hazardous waste, but the term an excluded recyclable material applies to RCRA wastes that aren't subject to RCRA regulations or California wastes. Now I just lost you, so let me try this again. One of the exceptions to the regulations is in the statute. It is called an excluded recyclable material. And for all intent and purposes, it's a hazardous waste. So to be a excluded recyclable material, if I've painted the impression that it takes it out of the regulatory arena, I have misled you, because it's not. We still have to manage it as a hazardous waste. But there's a separate, special set of circumstances on how that's accomplished in California. And that is found in the Health and Safety Code, section 25143.9. It's real simple. Yes? Wait a minute. I actually have a question. I appreciate that. I do. More than you can imagine. Okay. Yep. That's an excellent question. It depends on the excluded recyclable material, because if I take used oil as an example, used oil that's clean, treated on site, reused, that's used oil. That used oil is and counts against your generator status. The answer is yes. If I take used oil and I clean it, recycle it on site, and I go to Health and Safety Code section 25250.1, and I classify it as recyclable oil, and I test it for certain types of constituents in the oil, then taking that circuitous route, that used oil, which I can classify as recyclable oil, is not included in that. So there are certain circuitous exceptions to the rules. Now let's pretend I didn't say that, because we don't do that in California, because it requires a lot of testing and nobody does that. So yes, an excluded recyclable material counts against your generator status. Is that always the case? So when I say almost, now I'm confusing you. So let's just say, yeah. How's that? All right. Question? Yeah. You know, that's a great question. That's a very good question. No, probably not. And I've been coming to the conference now about, 18 years? And I always make it a point of asking Mickey Pierce and all the folks in DTSC and CUPAs, and how many people do it, how often is it done, when's it done, who does it? In this room, does anybody classify used oil as recyclable oil in California? No show of hands. Okay, you ready? I've never heard of anybody doing it. It exists. It's there. So far, and I'm an old guy, nobody does it. Because every time I do it, it says that you must test all oil to the criteria. So every time I do a batch of 50 gallons, 5,000 gallons, 500 million gallons, I've got to test it. And the criteria, it's called the standards of purity. So the criteria for the testing is kind of onerous, and every time I do it, I got to test it. So nobody has ever done it. So it exists by statute, but it's a what did you say? It's a what? Pat, stand up. No, stand up, Pat. No, stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Okay, turn around. Turn. Everybody can see your face. All right. Is your dad still here? Okay. So Pat Ledesma works for San Mateo Copa. Every year in the golf tournament, he takes first place. Hey, his team. It's not Pat. Every year, he beats me. I take second place. So he was giving me all kinds of encouragement, or lack thereof, yesterday on the golf course. And I think we tied. But I don't think we won. So where was I? What was I talking about? Use the oil. Yeah, okay. Nobody does it. Nobody does it. Yeah, it's a lost leader. It exists, but if you go through the statutory requirement to get it classified, nobody does it. So I've just wasted 5 minutes of your life. So I apologize. All right, but an excluded recyclable material, it is the best thing that happened to industry since sliced bread was invented, because it gives me an opportunity to reclaim, reuse, and manage my materials a little differently with some flexibility, rather than calling it a hazardous waste or marking it a hazardous waste. But there's guidelines. There's exceptions and there's exemptions. But how I manage an excluded recyclable materials is listed in the Health and Safety Code. But to be an excluded recyclable material, it has to be a hazardous waste. Has to be a hazardous waste. Okay, now we have a recyclable material. Check this out. A recyclable material is a waste that I produce that I reuse. It may be state-driven, federally driven. It may be excluded or exempted by statute or by regulation. It's a broad definition. And if I've got a recyclable material at my facility and it's a hazardous waste and I reclaim it and reuse it, what we have to file with the state of California is something called the Recyclable Materials Report. So every year, every other year, I have to file a report and tell my Coupa, hey, I'm collecting this stuff, it's a hazardous waste. Some of them are marked hazardous wastes. Some of them are marked excluded recyclable materials. But I reuse it, I reclaim it, and then I put it back in my process. But that is called a recyclable material. Here's my point. It is a hazardous waste. It does count against my generator status. So when someone says, oh, that's a recyclable material, that doesn't exclude them from anything. That's a hazardous waste. Okay, then we have retrograde. Retrograde material is a material that I buy it. Best example I give you is an epoxy or resin or paint. And I'm going to use it in my facility. And it says used before February of 2015. I don't use it. So 2015 comes and goes, and now it's approaching January of 2016. So it appears as if I can't use the material for its original intended purpose. I can. I don't think I can. I might. I'm not certain. So one example of a retrograde material is something that appears to have lost its utilitarian value. And so what the state says is if you've got a dated material that has an expiration date, which means that maybe it's not usable for what it was intentionally manufactured for, and that date comes and goes, well, then the state says you've got a year to decide what you want to do with it. And I decide I can continue using it for 5 more years. Oh, okay. And that is a hazardous material. That has nothing to do with being hazardous waste. I decide I got to get rid of it. I no longer intend to use it, or I can't use it. Oh, okay. Now that's a waste. And if it meets the definition of a hazardous waste, then during that interim time frame, that has become a retrograde material. So I never used it. It's not spent, it's not used, haven't used it. Probably it's dated. And now I'm trying to figure out and decide, can I continue to use it? And the state says you got a year. And if you decide you're not going to use it, at that point, it becomes a waste. And by definition, it becomes a hazardous waste. Now, I don't want to mislead you. There are materials that are dated, that have expiration dates, and when you decide to get rid of them, they may not be a hazardous waste. Those are not retrograde. Retrograde are those constituents, items, materials that I buy, purchase, that if you choose to get rid of them, by definition, they are a hazardous waste. And those, when I get rid of, are managed in California as a hazardous waste. So once the expiration date comes, you got to make a decision. I'm going to use it or I'm not going to use it. Generator discretion. I can't tell you you have to use it in a year, because that's not the case. I could use it next week, next month. I could decide that I'll use it in 10 years and it's still suitable for use. Okay, that's called the material. But you have to arbitrarily make a decision. There is no specific statutory or regulatory guidelines driven by the state or the federal government that says how that's documented. So I could open up the can, take the paint out, and put it on the wall and say, yep, I'm going to still use it. That's all I got to do. Or I can contact the manufacturer. Or I can do all kinds of things. But the second that I'm decided that I'm not going to use it, that material then becomes a hazardous waste. Okay, that's retrograde. Surplus. Yeah, question. 1 year. Okay, so a retrograde material, California says, I've got something that I intend to use, I buy it, I purchased it, haven't used it yet. It's sitting on a shelf. That's called a hazardous material, because I'm going to use it. It's not been used. I'm going to use it. So it's paint, oil, epoxy resins, fuel, it could be anything. It could be an acid, caustic, it could be anything, a reagent. So it's sitting on the shelf, and when I get rid of it, that's a hazardous waste. But I'm not going to get rid of it. I'm going to use it. And so it sits on the shelf, and then it says it expires February of 2015. I did not use it this month. So March, next month. I haven't used it yet, and for all intent and purposes, there's an appearance that I can't use it anymore. It's off spec. So I now have a year to decide, can I continue using it or not? I've got 1 year to make that decision. So between February of 2015 and February of 2016, I've got a year to figure out, can I continue using it or not? That's the year. That's the year. And if I don't, then the state says, oh, congratulations. That's a hazardous waste. Yeah. How do I decide that? The world's the limit. I can do it a lot of different ways. Typically, you can contact the manufacturer. You can apply it to your process. I mean, certain types of military specifications require certain types of specs for certain types of materials. This came about because of an issue that occurred down in Marine Logistics Base in Barstow, where they were forced to dispose of a lot of oil never used because it wasn't up to military specs. So they disposed of it. It was 30,000 gallons. This is back in the late 80s, early 90s. Well, they said we could use this as a lubricant. We just can't use it in this process that we purchased it for originally. So they came up with this whole retrograde definition. It says, oh, okay, well, if you can use it over here, and it's a viable alternative as something that similarly would be manufactured for that process, then that's still a material. You can still keep it, and you can keep it on site for a week, month, year, a millennium. That's generator's discretion. How long can you keep it for? Well, looks like it'll be good for another 30 years. Then that's a material for the next 30 years. Does that make sense? Surplus. Pretty simple. I'm going to paint the room. I'm going to buy 30 gallons of beige or cream-colored paint. I'm going to paint this room. I buy 30 gallons. It takes 20 gallons. I got 10 gallons left. That's surplus. I'm going to keep it for touch-up. That's surplus. That has nothing to do with being a hazardous waste. So I'm going to store it at my facility, and I have to label it according to HAZCOM, Play Right to Know, but none of the hazardous waste regulations apply to that. That's surplus. That's not used, nor is it spent. It's maybe opened, but it's not used, nor is it spent. That's just surplus material. Yeah, Pat? Oof, yeah, okay, well. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, that's a great question. California in the statute says, yeah, you know, if it's in a damaged container bag for more than 96 hours, that's a waste. California also says, hey, if it's mismarked, mislabeled, or not labeled for 10 or more days, that's a waste. So that scenario involving a fertilizer, a damaged bag or not labeled or not legible, you've got 4 days or 10 days for that to be corrected. And if it exists beyond that 4 days or 10 days time frame, the California statute says, yep, congratulations, that's a waste. And it may be likely that it's a hazardous waste. So under that scenario, Pat, that X-nays this whole surplus. Does that make sense? Yeah. Well, and if it was there the last time you were there, and you come back 2 weeks later, and it's still there, and you still notice it, yeah, it's kind of game over. Yeah. Okay, sir. Yeah. Retrograde. Okay. Are those chemicals you want to give to your neighbor, are they dated? They are, okay. Have they been used? Okay. 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 Yep. Okay. Yep. The ones that are dated, have the date already come and gone, or they're dated but the date is still good? Still good. So I have two types. I have some chemicals that are dated, some that aren't, and the ones that are dated, some have come and gone and some haven't. Okay, and I'm gonna give those to my neighbor. Okay, did you sell them for commercial value or did you give them? So now we're gonna go to 6 scenarios. Some are dated and some aren't. Some are expired, some hasn't. Some I sell and some I give. Is that what you want me to say? Now you realize that what I tell you has no bearing because I'm not an attorney in a court of law. I've been around the block long enough to know kind of how we paint the perception here, okay? All right, so the ones that I sell for their commercial value, that's called a product. That's commerce. That's in trade. That's off my radar, okay? Okay, the ones you give away. It's expired or not expired, doesn't matter. If you sell them, yep, and they're used for their originally intended purpose, or as a substitute in a process that, okay, we're good there. We're good there. Yeah. Now let's go to the chemicals I gave away. Okay, you gave them to an industry. Okay. There you go, across the bay, okay. They're a startup. There we go. Absolutely. So we give them to them. And we give them to them because we're not going to use them anymore. So we're going to relinquish them. Right? Are you relinquishing them? You're relinquishing them. Yeah. Well, no, I didn't say it's hazardous waste yet. You're relinquishing them, right? So when you relinquish them, you don't want them, right? Right. Were you going to use them? No. Okay, right. And you gave them to you gave them to them. Yeah. Are they going to use them for their original intended purpose when they were manufactured, or as a suitable substitute for something that they would actually use in their process? Okay, we used to call that the waste exchange. It doesn't really exist anymore in California because of liability issues. But we used to have something like that. Okay? It worked kind of eclectic, and then we don't do it anymore. So you gave them those chemicals. So why didn't you sell them? Good Samaritan, right? Oh, so you're avoiding the costs of disposing of those chemicals by giving them away. Now, I like that. No, I like that. I think that I have found kind of this great idea. I'm going to take my dirt, little stuff in there, and I'm going to give it away for landfill. Okay? How many attorneys exist in the state of California? Now there is a number. Yeah, and I don't know that one either. I can tell you this, it's a lot. I can also tell you the debt for an attorney is significant. And I can also say that when I relinquish those chemicals to that industry, and let's say they don't use it. Let's say they don't use it. And take those chemicals and just get rid of it. Where'd those chemicals come from? So I can paint 40 scenarios, and probably 20 of them were probably okay, and our intent was correct, and we were above board about it, and so was that individual. And I can also paint probably 20 scenarios where you've engaged in an act, maybe not gross negligence, but negligence. Probably not criminal, but I can make it criminal. We're all over the board. Yeah. So if I'm going to give them away, I think I'm going to have some type of concurrence from some type of agency that this is legitimate. If I'm going to sell them, I'm off the radar. If I'm going to sell them for the commercial value, that's still a product. That's still a material. But if I'm avoiding hazardous waste disposal fees by giving it away and it never gets used, and then they, through negligence on their part, get rid of it and ends up causing environmental degradation, you've relinquished something. California says, yeah, you know, if you get rid of something, that's called relinquishing. And if you relinquish something, then it's subject to being a hazardous waste. So I'm now went from gray to dark gray. I mean, I'm almost in the black. So I think we have to be pretty judicious how we proceed. You know what I just did? I said nothing for 5 minutes. You know that. Because I didn't answer your question. Question? Yeah. For commercial value for the product, where I'm not at risk is if I sell it for its commercial value. Right, I'm going there. I give them a 10% discount. That's commercial value. That's called fair trade. 50% discount. Wow, you're a good Samaritan. 90% discount. Okay. First of all, it may cost me more to dispose of it than even selling it, right? So there's cash exchange to sell it. I'm avoiding fees and taxes by a regulatory agency. So there's already a trade-off even if I give it away. But if I sell it for its original or intended or fair trade value, we're good to go. If I sell it for 5% of its value, you're really giving it away. You're not selling it at a discount. You're giving it away, and you're actually providing kind of a sham perception of the commercial value. So is it really commercial value? You could do it. I can do it. It's been done. We could do it. But recognize that we're kind of shading the gray. You want to shade it? It's your discretion. Yeah. I would make certain to vet the company I'm selling it to, but that's commercial value. But what you're doing at 5% of its value is you're basically giving it to them and you're having them pay you a little bit. That could be a sham. Maybe not. Maybe you're a good guy. Maybe it is. There was a question. I'm sorry? Clearance. Going out of business. 50% off, 75% off. Yeah. Do you do it regularly or is it a one-time basis? Is the company you sell it to legitimately going to use it? Good, okay. Is the company you sell it to that's going to legitimately use it, do they have to further process it before they can use it? They do? Don't know. Don't know. Because if they have to further process it before they can use it, and they can't introduce it directly into their process, that's called treatment. That makes them viable for being licensed and permitted to handle that. You're the generator sending hazardous waste that you're relinquishing to. Yeah. All this started because of your question. You know that. And I have gotten through, you ready? 3 slides. Go ahead, Pat. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. As long as is industry going to the chem lab? Industry, yeah, yeah. And it may be that they're trying to provide assistance to the chem lab and that the school district or university or college has budget constraints and they really could use it and they can demonstrate that. That sounds more legitimate to me than I'm trying to get rid of something that avoid cost for disposal. Then it's both. Yeah. Who figures out who figures out what it is? Yeah. Yeah, we're all over the board. Yeah. And I am not a very smart guy. I couldn't figure it out. Question? Yeah. Hmm. Okay, you take hazardous waste from other people, and then you sell it for commercial value. Oh, okay. And your question's what? So they paid you for you to take it. And then you sell it to industry to use as virgin product. While you take it, do you do something to it before it's sold? Okay. You have developed the perfect model for any capitalistic person in California. Yeah, you probably can talk to me on the break, okay? Okay. All right. Any other questions? Any other questions? We're good? We're good? Okay. All right, here we go. Federal terms. Okay, so these are defined federally under RCRA, not state. These are defined under RCRA. And I got to apologize. I left my watch and my golf bag. I don't have a clue what time it is. 9:03, okay. At 9:45, I have to let you go for 15 minutes to get coffee and danishes and water and use the facilities. And who could I trust? I could probably trust almost everybody in this room. So I need someone to say it's 9:45 when it's 9:45. Who's that? You got it. You're the man. What were we doing? Oh, federal terms. These are out of RCRA. These are federal terms out of RCRA, not state. These terms are state. These are state terms, state definition driven by the state. You will not find these defined federally. There's one exception to that. A recyclable material is defined federally. There's a federal definition of that. Well, there's also a state. They're similar. They're not the same. All right, federal terms. Okay, I've got a list of wastes that are generated from materials that I buy and I have at my facility, and I decide, nah, I'm not going to use it. I'm going to get rid of them. So I'm going to get rid of these. I didn't use them. Didn't use them. Not spent. Not used. I bought them. I decide not to use them. I get rid of them. So if I have a sole active constituent, spill residue thereof, in my material that I bought, and I didn't use it, and it's really toxic, we call that an acutely hazardous waste federally, and we give it a P code, and it's called the acutely hazardous waste P-listed waste. So then we got the same thing also, that are chemicals that I buy, I didn't use, and now I'm going to get rid of them. They're not really toxic, but they're toxic. They're regulated. Those chemicals are the U-waste codes. So it's two different lists. Chemicals are on one or the other. By the way, add up both lists, it's about 1,000 chemicals. How many chemicals do we use in California? My point to all this, and I keep trying to draw it back, and I have not made the point. Here's the point. These lists are so finite. You really, to look at whether something's regulated, you almost have to look at its characteristics and the fish bioassay, and does it kill fish, and there's a whole separate criteria we'll talk about after the break. But an acutely hazardous waste in California is specific to federal listed chemicals, number one. Number two, we have something called the triple rinse rule. Hey, I got a container, a bucket, a quart, a gallon, a 5-gallon drum. I empty it, and I throw it away. Most instances, it's garbage, throw it away. It's just garbage. It's solid waste, not hazardous waste. But if it contains an extremely hazardous waste, California, or an acutely hazardous waste, federally, RCRA, and you go throw it away, then that container is still subject to being a hazardous waste even when it's emptied, regardless of its size, unless you triple rinse it. Now, the act of triple rinsing the container may be considered treatment. And if I triple rinse the container, then I can get rid of it as solid waste, not a hazardous waste. But the triple rinse rule was born from a federal requirement that said that if you had an acutely hazardous waste, which was P-listed, in a chemical, in a container, and you empty it, federally, you had to triple rinse it before you could dispose of the container as solid waste, not hazardous waste. So the triple rinse that you hear about on occasion in industry came from that P-listed waste code. Okay? Now, federally, under RCRA, not state, federal, there is two categories of materials that you've never used and you get rid of. Those are P and U. And then they have a listing of processes and industries where if you produce a waste after it's been subjected to a process, we're going to regulate the waste that's produced from that process. Those are called the specific source and non-specific source codes. Those are the F's and the K's. So if you look at RCRA, hey, did you use that chemical? No. Then you look at the P and the U list. If you use the chemical, it may be on the F or the K list because those are spent materials. They've been used. They have to be processed prior to reuse. Those chemicals come from a process. So this waste that's in this drum that comes from that process, it may be an F, it may be a K, it may not, but it could not be a P or a U waste because it's been used. For a P or a U waste, you can't have used it. Virgin. And then we have something called the characteristic waste. Federally, there's 4 characteristics. Ironically, California, there is 4 characteristics. And they're the same 4 characteristics. They're not defined the same, but there's 4 characteristics. The 4 characteristics that meet the federal definition of a hazardous waste, we designate those wastes with a D code. It's a 4-digit number. It starts D and it's followed by a numerical script. And that is a characteristic waste. And then a lot of things are born from that. Your universal treatment standards, your treatment standards for land disposal restrictions. That criteria on what makes a waste a hazardous waste federally, a lot of wastes come from being captured because they meet the definition of a hazardous waste based on a broad definition. We call those characteristic wastes, i.e., is it ignitable, flammable, corrosive, or toxic? Yeah, question. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's called the mixture rule. Yeah, it'll come up. It'll come up. Yep. And if I don't cover it, I'll be more than amenable to explain it on the break or afterwards. Yeah. Yeah, it's called the mixture rule. Oh, footnote. For land disposal restrictions, that does affect what we do in California. But the mixture rule really doesn't carry a lot of weight in California because we can't do a lot of the things that the mixture rule allows other industries outside California to do. Let me explain that. No, it's going to come up. I'll explain it then. I'll explain it later. Any other questions? Question? The product you create? We can flush it down the toilet. Yeah, sometimes we could. Yeah, yeah. If we have POT, NPDES permit restrictions that don't allow us to, we can't. If the rinsate is a hazardous waste, we can't. Some of the rinsate ends up being a hazardous waste. Some of the rinsate, not a hazardous waste. Yeah, yeah. And I'm going to go back to that very same question I just had. If it's a federal listed waste and it's captured, it's always a federal listed waste. I could never flush it down the toilet. Yeah. If it's a characteristic waste and the rinsate does not exhibit a characteristic and so it's not a hazardous waste, then I can flush it down the toilet. Yeah. So it really depends on the process in which it's produced and generated and its characteristics. Yeah. Check this out. I get it every year. Buckland said I can flush it down the toilet. So people will go back and they'll rinse their materials and they'll buy this big toilet and they go, Buckland, this guy, he can. I didn't say that. But yeah. Question. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. The question was, can I flush my rinsate down the toilet? Yeah, I will. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Some of the federal definitions, not so much state, federal. Some of the federal definitions, the process that produces the waste may actually capture it, and whatever waste that I produce, regardless of the characteristics, make it a hazardous waste. So I need to know how it was produced to know if it's listed. And if it's a federal waste that's listed because of the process that produces it, yeah, that may always be a waste. So I can't flush it down the toilet. Yes, yes. And the second part is, hey, it's not listed. It's not listed. Well, can I flush it down the toilet? Well, okay, so it's not listed. We have to determine if it's a characteristic waste. And California's definition of a characteristic waste is broader in scope. It captures a lot of stuff, more so than the federal definition. Yeah. All right, we good? I'm going to make it to my 6th slide before the break. Okay, and then we have something called the conditionally exempt small and large quantity generator. Really doesn't have a lot to do with what makes a waste a hazardous waste. That's going to be discussed in nauseam for the next 4 days, so I don't need to spend any time talking about how we categorize our status. One exception, if you produce a hazardous waste in California, state or federal, it influences your generator status. And if I generate enough waste, I'm a large quantity. If I generate a small amount, I may be a small or conditionally exempt. So it does affect what is a waste, your generator status. Okay, and RCRA, that means federal. RCRA, under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act passed in '76, it defined what a hazardous waste was. Check this out. In '75, I could dig a hole in the ground, grab my waste, reactive, water reactive, not so much radioactive, but just, and I could bury it. '76, they said, yeah, you know, we don't want to do that. And we want to try to recover it. And when we recover waste, and we reuse it, recycle it, and reclaim it, then we're doing a benefit to the earth and the environment. So they passed, check it out, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. That's RCRA. And when they did that, they did not want to bury waste. They did a study 7.5 years later. In '83, Congress got a study to determine how much waste is being reclaimed. And we buried all but about 1% in '76. How much were we reclaiming and reusing in '83 when they did the study to see how effective RCRA was? We went from a whopping 1% to almost 2%. Congress viewed that as a failure. So they passed the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments in '84. And in '85 to 1991, if you have a federal waste, not California, federal, a federal waste, it is no longer able to be disposed of to a land unless it meets a treatment standard. And so all federal wastes were gradually restricted. And so one of the most important things that a generator has to do when they go forward with trying to classify their waste, if you apply a federal waste code to my waste stream, it drives the treatment standard. And when it drives that treatment standard that it drives tells me and you and the rest of the world how you can get rid of it, how it has to be treated. And I have to disclose that and tell the facility that does it every day what they have to do, which I'm clueless on what they have to do. So it's kind of a cart and a horse. We got it backwards. But you, the generator, has to fill out a land disposal restriction notification form and tell the landfill on a one-time basis how to treat that waste. Now let me tell you what I just said, but I didn't say. Here we go. California wastes, most of that is not restricted. There are some. There's 6 categories. Federally, all federal wastes are restricted. So when I produce that waste stream, I have to fill out a document when I use this facility over here for the first time, and I have to tell them that it's land disposal restricted. I have to tell them that. That's the case across the board for all federal wastes. Not California, but all federal. And then TCLIP. The toxicity concentration leachate procedure is the methodology that was developed federally that simulates the conditions that exist in a landfill when I bury my waste. Let me tell you what I just said. Up until HISWA 84, we used to have what's called an extraction procedure, EP toxicity test, to determine whether or not a waste was hazardous. Old methodology, old procedure. In 84, they said, yeah, we really should develop a process that simulates how waste is actually going to use the soil as a vector and move through the soil. And so the toxicity characteristic leachate procedure is a leaching procedure that's simulated in the laboratory that determines the fate of a chemical if you bury it in the ground. And if you bury it in the ground, chemicals migrate in the ground when it rains and through groundwater and the like. Well, that fate, that mobile vector in the ground is simulated using this procedure. Now, what I just said, but I didn't tell you, is that under TCLIP, there are 8 federal metals, and there's 32 organics. Ready? Federally, under RCRA, we've determined whether something's hazardous for 40 chemicals. How many is used in the state of California? 40. I have a list of 40. And if I have a chemical above a certain threshold, hazardous waste, federally. That is the federal list for toxicity. And the methodology that we use to test for that is called TCLIP. Very finite list. You know how big California's list is? 38. These are small lists. But California says, yeah, I tell you what, before we decide to just put it in a landfill, let's see if it kills fish. And that's the test that captures a lot of things. All right, so that's it. And then we have other terms. If I work at a facility that generates hazardous waste, and I put it in a drum, tote, portable tank, and I manage it, close it, inspect it, remove it, and do something to that container or tank, you are considered facility personnel. You, that individual, has to be trained on an annual basis. Not satellite or workplace areas. But if it's in a 90-day accumulation area and I manage my wastes, going in, taking out, inspecting, closing, opening those containers, you are facility personnel. You are required to be trained every year. That's the definition that exists both state and federal. If I take my waste and I flush it down the toilet, that goes to a publicly owned treatment works facility. I'll say that differently. It goes to the sewer. Not stormwater, it goes to the sewer. The POTW has a permit issued under the NPDES system under the Clean Water Act. And they treat it, and then they discharge their effluent to the Pacific Ocean. So a POTW has federally the ability to accept a hazardous waste. You can flush a hazardous waste to a POTW nationally. However, not in California. So if you read that in the federal guidelines and the federal statutes and the federal regulations, it exists. Not in California. I got to make that clear. Because then someone's going to say, hey, Buckland said you can flush the stuff in the toilet because they can treat it. And federally you can do it if they can. Not in California. And then we have restricted waste, those are land disposal, and then we came up with a list in 92, 93 that said, hey, you know what? We have lots of different industries that produce very similar wastes. Fluorescent tubes, certain types of electronic devices. We have batteries. These are produced by industries across the board. So let's put together a standard of what we can provide some flexibility on how these are managed. And let's say you can keep them for a year, not 90 days or 180, keep them on site for a year. And you just have to tell me what they are and the date, and I don't have to do the hazardous components and the physical state, and we'll make labeling easier. So we don't have to do our weekly inspections for these things. So there's this flexibility afforded to a lot of businesses that produce these types of waste. We're going to call them universal wastes. A universal waste, by definition, is regulated as a hazardous waste, but we call it a universal waste. And we're afforded some flexibility on how we manage them. All right. I'm sorry. What's Osh's last name? Pat? From DTSC. You know? Aurora. Asha. Thick accent. Asha? Okay. All right. 1, 2, 3 years ago. 2 years ago. 2 years ago. 2 years ago. Almost to the day. The definition of a hazardous waste is a waste that meets the definition of a hazardous waste. What? Universal wastes are hazardous wastes. Nowhere in the statute or regulation does it exclude those universal wastes from your generator status determination. Who asked the question? Okay. 2 years ago, there was guidance that had been put out by the state that inferred that it was not to be included in your generator status because universal wastes are not manifested. And the guidance was, well, you don't manifest it, and we're not going to include it. So not to be included. Guidance. Call a management memo. Not a regulation, not a statute. Guidance. OSHA said 2 years ago at this conference, there's nothing that says they're not. Nothing. Nothing. And this came up as a topic of conversation last year. And last year, I'm not a smart guy. I'm really not. So I'm talking to DTSCs and Koopas, and you know what I figured out? We don't know. We don't know. And we're counting, and it does count against it counts against a lot of stuff. It really does. And it gets reported for a lot of things. And I have some Koopas that say it does, and I have other Koopas that say it doesn't. I have some people in the state that says, yeah, no, and other people says, yeah. So I cannot answer that question. But I'm not very smart, so I'm not going to try. Pat, you want to give some insight to that? You have some insight? DTSC? No? Yes. Yesterday. Yep. And you include that for your generator status. There we go. So Asha got what she wanted, and that's in stark difference to the guidance that was put out prior to. So I still don't know, but I believe you are an honest person, and I believe that. There you go. Yeah, and it seems to be more at the local level, Koopa City County, than it is at the state. And Asha, representing DTSC, was a little more pedantic, a little more black and white. Right. Yeah. 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 Sir. Yeah, universal waste requires it's. Okay, are we talking universal waste or hazardous waste? Okay, hazardous waste. And I put it on a forklift, and where do I take the forklift? To my 90 days accumulation area? Okay, so you affect compliance. You would be required to be trained annually. There's 5 elements specified in Title 22. They're broad. They're very broad. And you know what? I can do it in 5 minutes or 40 hours. I would document it. Yeah. Yep. Where are we at? Okay. All right. So, okay, person, generator. Okay, so if I produce a waste, and the waste that I produce may not be something I use. I get rid of something. You just produce the waste. If I subject a material that I decide to relinquish, dispose of off property, don't want to use it anymore, that's a waste, then I am, by definition, the generator. Check this out. We do a lot of stuff for the Department of Justice. So we go back to Quantico. We're involved in the Clan Lab program. So we wrote a program for DEA back in '87. Law enforcement, they don't buy chemicals to make meth. They do not want the chemicals that make meth. But their action, when they confiscate those and they get rid of it, subjects those chemicals to hazardous waste regulations. So they didn't buy it, they didn't want it, they didn't use it. But their action subjects those chemicals to being managed as hazardous waste. That law enforcement agency is, by federal and state definition, the generator. I own some property in Shasta. So someone abandons their chemicals on my property. I contact Shasta County Environmental Health, Jeff, the individual that just introduced me. Hey, Jeff, I got these 4 drums. They look pretty dilapidated, and the stuff is smoking. What do you think? Oh, wow, that's messed up. I'm the generator. Now, they may work with me on being judicious and appropriate in terms of how I dispose of it, but my actions of contacting an agency subjects those materials. If they meet the definition of a hazardous waste, I'm the generator. I'm the generator. I'm a utility company. I have an easement. It's abandoned on the easement. Okay, that's called criminal. There's criminal negligence involved. But my actions on trying to manage that subjects those items to being a hazardous waste if they meet the definition of a hazardous waste. A producer is a generator. A generator is a producer. I ship it off-site. They call you a shipper. The shipper is the producer is the shipper, and the generator is the shipper and the producer. In other words, there's semantics defined by different agencies, but you're the same person. So if you decide to get rid of something, you are the producer of that waste. We call you the generator. We're good? We're good? Okay. Yeah. Not necessarily. I mean, I got to get an EPA ID number that I get from the state or the federal government based on if state waste or federal waste and how much state and federal waste. But I have to identify myself to the world, and then the CUPA. I exposed myself to the CUPA because I have an EPA ID number. Yeah. So I have to do that. And then depending on my status, I may have to do SB 14, biennial report if I'm a record large quantity. I mean, there's a lot of things that once I get a number, I'm now required to conform to. Yeah. All right, so that's a producer. Okay, types of waste. Well, types of waste that we consider hazardous waste in California include things like used oil, paint, solvents, antifreeze, contaminated containers, some instances, not all, oil filters, fuel filters, aerosol cans, get rid of them. These are examples of hazardous waste. Some of these are examples of items that are not hazardous waste. Some of these are not hazardous waste. Most of these are hazardous waste though, particularly used oil. By statute, it's a hazardous waste. Most paint, almost all solvents. There's some exceptions because the definition of a solvent means that it dissolves something. You know what dissolves things? Water. Yeah, so that's a solvent that probably is not a hazardous waste. Sometimes it is a hazardous waste. All right, so I'm going to classify it. Here we go. It's taken us 1 hour and 34 minutes. We're about to do it. All right? So, is my waste hazardous? All right? Here's this is the biggest first fundamental question. Is it a waste? Because if I intend to use it, and I haven't used it yet, that doesn't sound like a waste to me. So only items that I intend to get rid of, relinquish, those are, by definition, wastes. So my question to you or for industry is, first determine whether or not my waste is something that is actually, by definition, is it a waste. That's actually found in 66-261.2, the definition of waste. That's the relinquish, the reclaim, the recycle, it's all in there. Okay, now, is it a hazardous waste? Because if it's not a waste, it can't be a hazardous waste. It's a waste. Oh, okay. So does it meet the definition of a hazardous waste? That's our discussion for the balance of the program. Is the waste, by definition, if it's hazardous, there's exclusions that appear or occur in the regulation. It's 66-261.4. For example, secondary materials. What's that? I have a process, and I introduce a chemical into the process. Goes through the process. It's removed from the process. And then I take that chemical that I've already used. I may or may not have to treat it. And for a secondary material, you can't treat it. And then I introduce it back into the same process without treatment. I call that a secondary material. That's excluded. The definition of a secondary material probably isn't a hazardous waste. We're California. Some secondary materials are a hazardous waste. But by definition, federally they're not. And by most instances in California, they're probably not. But we kind of go on and further say, well, is it a closed pipe system? Do you treat it? Is it maintained on site for more than 12 months? Is it reclaimed? So we give all these criteria for a secondary material. And if it meets all of that criteria, that secondary material, that's excluded. So there's exceptions to the rules. So, and we get these questions on occasion, and I'm sure industry has them and agencies review them. But if I take something out of a process and then I reintroduce it back into the process, yeah, I'm going to call it a secondary material. Probably is. And by federal definition, it probably is. That does not mean that it's not a hazardous waste, because some secondary materials are and some are not. So if I say to the world, that's a secondary material, that's like saying I'm a guy. There's a lot of different types of guys. Right? All right, so that. Okay, is it a waste? Here we go. And I may make it through these set of slides before we take a break. A waste, by definition, California, is a material that I intend to get rid of. Waste. I don't want it anymore. Waste. That is any discarded material that does not qualify for some type of a statutory health and safety code, 25143.2, or regulatory 66261.4 exclusion. So without exceptions to the rules, let me just say that differently. I'm going to get rid of it. Oh, okay. You're discarding it. And that, what you're discarding, is a waste. Then I have to decide if it's a hazardous waste. That's what I got to do. So it's discarded. Here is the definition of discarded. A discarded material, California, is any material that is relinquished. I'm going to get rid of it, including I'm going to dispose of it, I'm going to burn it, I'm going to incinerate it, I'm going to accumulate it prior to disposing of it or burning it or incinerating it. That's relinquished. So if I'm going to relinquish something, that's called discarded. If the stuff that I want to discard is a hazardous waste, by definition, by criteria, then it's subject to hazardous waste criteria. It's subject to being a hazardous waste. You've got to manage it as a hazardous waste. I'm going to recycle it. I'm going to recycle it. I'm going to recycle it prior to it being applied to land in a manner that constitutes disposing. So I'm going to recycle it, and then I'm going to bury it. Okay? Oh, okay. That recycling, before it's buried, you're going to reuse it, and then you're going to bury it. By definition, that is considered something that you're going to discard, because your intention is to get rid of it. So I'm going to recycle it, and then I'm going to get rid of it. Oh, okay. Then the process of recycling the material before you bury it makes the material before you recycle it a hazardous waste. Also makes the material that you bury a hazardous waste. Inherently waste-like. Okay, it looks like you can get rid of it. It's a fertilizer in a bag on a pallet, unmarked, it's leaking, doesn't look like you can use it, and it's clumped together. It's not in a powdered form anymore, it's kind of solidified. That looks like it's inherently waste-like. Okay, that, by definition, would make it something that is going to be discarded by definition. Okay, and this is here's Pat's insight. If I've got a material that poses a threat to the environment, and it turns out that it's not been labeled, or it's been mislabeled, or it's not legible and I can't read the label for 10 days, then by definition, that material is determined and deemed discarded. You're not going to use it. And if you were, the HAZCOM standard would say, yeah, you got to actually have it labeled and you have to have information on the hazards. So that is discarded. That is a waste. It may not make it a hazardous waste, and it may make it a hazardous waste, but that is a waste. That's a waste. These are definitions of waste. Doesn't mean they're a hazardous waste, but it's got to be a waste first before it becomes a hazardous waste. And the material that poses a threat to the human health and or the environment, and it's in a deteriorated or damaged package. So I can read the label on it, and it's labeled and it's marked, but the package is damaged. If that occurs for 4 days, then by definition, that is a waste. Maybe a hazardous waste, maybe not. That is a waste. And if it's a waste, it may exhibit a hazardous waste characteristic. Okay, 4 types of wastes. Here we go. I can have a waste that I've determined to be hazardous by either using my knowledge. And my knowledge is something that is typically declared by the generator. It's because they have an idea of the process that produces it, the chemicals that are used in the process. We call that generator knowledge. That knowledge is probably what determines our materials for being a waste in the state of California 80 to 90% of the time. We're not that judicious about testing it. Some industries are very judicious and they test all their waste. Very expensive. It's not very expensive. I do it in-house. I don't do it in-house. There is not a regulatory requirement, state or federal, that requires me to test my waste. Not one. You could say it's hazardous waste and manage it accordingly. Now, the facility I ship it to requires me to test it. Oh, okay, well, that's an operational issue. But you do not have to test your waste. Oh, by the way, you have to have knowledge of your waste, and you have to know the characteristics of your waste. Well, I'm not certain about that. I mean, I put these different materials in a drum, and sometimes they're different concentrations. It's kind of a witch's brew. Sometimes I have more of this solvent than that, and this is chlorinated. And something. You can do anything you want. But the regulations are written that not only do you have knowledge, but you are liable and responsible for the characteristics of the waste. So by default, it's not uncommon that I may test it. And I might not test it. But I don't have to test it. That's the point. You could have knowledge. You don't have to test it. I don't have knowledge. Well, probably better test it. Now, that is declared. What else makes a waste hazardous? And that's that presumptive list. We'll talk about that after the break. If my waste is a waste that exhibits 4 characteristics, then my waste that I dispose of, that I relinquish, that I've discarded in California is a hazardous waste. And they are wastes that are ignitable, that's predominantly flashpoint, corrosive, based on pH, acids and bases. Reactive, does it react with the water? Does it burn spontaneously if ignited and persistently to create a fire? That's a reactive waste. Or is it toxic? 2 big broad definitions, one state's, one's federal. But those are wastes that we'll discuss after the break that are characteristic wastes. And that, if it meets the definition of any of those characteristics, hazardous waste. Does not meet any of the definitions of characteristic waste. Oh, okay. Then, is it listed? Federally, there's a list of wastes that are listed. California, we have a listed waste that have mercury in them based on their origin. We have a listed waste. So we don't worry about that light ballasts and that fluorescent tube, how much mercury is in the fluorescent tube. We used to play this kind of green tip, not green tip, it's below the T-clip, but the California says, time out. There is mercury that is required to illuminate a fluorescent tube. It's listed. We now call it a universal waste. So we don't care how much is in there. We used to be able to land dispose of those based on the concentration for the T-clip. Now, we're done with all that. If it's a fluorescent tube, universal waste. That's a hazardous waste. Question? Yeah, so it's the weight of the entire tube. The weight of the entire tube, yeah. You got it. Question? Broken? Broken. The regulations for a broken fluorescent tube allows me to manage it as universal waste if I package it individually. Or I can manage it as a hazardous waste. It's your option. But if it's broken, it's going to have to be isolated and packaged separately. but I can still manage it as universal waste if I do that. Footnote, don't break them. Any other questions? We're good? Break time.